I'm the president and CEO of Montpelier. I'm pleased to welcome you here tonight to the Constitutional Toolkit series. First, I'd love to introduce you to Emily Voss, the Montpelier Center for the Constitution Education Director and our lead staff member for our new Constitution Initiative. Next, I'd like to welcome back a great friend of Montpelier, Christopher Riano, and his institution that he leads, the Center for Civic Education. Mr. Riano, thank you for co-hosting this series with Montpelier, and I'll turn it over to you now to introduce our guests and the program this evening.
Thank you so much, Roy. I really appreciate that. And I have to say that I've been so thrilled to see the success of this program, but I am personally very, very excited for this evening's program when we talk about what it's interacting with law enforcement and the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments to the Constitution. And I could not be more pleased than to be joined by two of the leading experts in the country when it comes to looking at the way in which that operates and works. And so I'm going to say brief introductions of both of them and give a little bit of background on how the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments have evolved coming out of the British system, because obviously they come out of the British system. But in many ways, this is going to look a little different than some of our other Toolkit series because U.S. Attorney Bacon and U.S. Attorney Gonzalez and I are definitely going to make this more of a conversation and a panel between the three of us, since you have two preeminent prosecutors from across the country and a former prosecutor who's not that preeminent and now just works in the constitutional law and civic education space. So with that, I'm going to start with U.S. Attorney Bacon. And U.S. Attorney Bacon is the acting U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of New York. She's a career federal prosecutor, having served in numerous roles in the Department of Justice, including most recently as the National Elder Justice Coordinator and Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Office of the Attorney General. She's also worked as the National White-Collar Crime Coordinator in the Executive Office for the United States Attorneys. And one of her really amazing claims to fame, and I'm sure she'll correct me if I get this wrong, is Attorney Bacon famously prosecuted one of the largest, if not the largest, public corruption prosecutions in the history of the United States in the city of Cleveland in Northern Ohio. And in honor of U.S. Attorney Bacon, I am wearing my Northern District of New York badge this evening, just to help represent the state of New York. Not that we don't love U.S. Attorney Gonzalez and everything that you're doing in Florida. And so I'm so excited to have you, U.S. Attorney Bacon. Thank you for being here this evening. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. And I also, of course, want to take a quick second to introduce the acting United States Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. And U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, prior to assuming this role, was the first assistant U.S. attorney, which is essentially the deputy person in that office. He also is a career prosecutor who's held numerous supervisory positions within the office. He's been a state's attorney, so also a state prosecutor in Florida. And throughout his career, he's worked on a number of complex, high-profile cases, including illegal gambling, money laundering, and significant RICO conspiracy and narcotics trafficking cases. And right before we joined, we were just talking about one of his largest cases, which was the prosecution on the dark web of an individual who was known as the Oxy Monster. So I'm exceedingly happy to have both U.S. Attorney Gonzalez with us today, U.S. Attorney Bacon with us today. And yes, I am the president of the Center for Civic Education, but before this, 2 jobs ago, I was the general counsel for the New York State Liquor Authority. So essentially the Attorney General of Booze, as everybody used to call me, because the 21st Amendment precludes the federal government from having much to do with the alcoholic beverage control law, where I did prosecute the largest case in the history of the United States since Prohibition for a state agency. So I can say just a little bit about the civil side of what it's like to be a prosecutor. And with that, I want to give a little bit of background before we really dig into our conversation this evening that both U.S. Attorney Gonzalez and U.S. Attorney Bacon have so graciously helped put together. Like I said, this is going to be a little bit unique. And why do I say that? Well, I want to give us kind of a framework and a basis for how we can look this evening at, in many ways, the British framework and how that had such an influence on state constitutions in the United States, especially when it comes to the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, and obviously the federal Constitution of the United States when it comes to the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, to just give a little bit of why these past actions of the British government have an influence today in our laws. Because when we think about the importance of striking a balance between obviously protecting the public and the public safety, and of course, protecting our constitutional and individual rights, there's a lot of costs to getting it wrong. And that's one of the things that prosecutors frequently are navigating and thinking about in these spaces. If you are too loose, it's law enforcement tramples on these rights that we have in the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments and individual liberties. And if they're too restrictive, law enforcement can lack the tools to prevent and minimize crime, which obviously we want to ensure doesn't happen because crime impacts innocent people. And the British framework gives us such an incredible background to kick us off, because something that often is not thought about when it comes to where the Fourth Amendment comes from is this concept that was known back before we had a constitution and before we had state constitutions of the writs of assistance. And these are really important foundational things to think about. And why do I say that? Well, if we look at the Fourth Amendment today, and we can look at it and think about the Fourth Amendment today, it talks about the four protections in many ways that we see. Protections against being searched when it comes to your person, your house, your papers, your effects, and it includes what's known as the particularity clause, meaning that a warrant has to particularly show where a search is going to take place under the Fourth Amendment. And this is really important, and it is a direct result of the way in which the British writs of assistance looked very, very, very different. And you can look all the way back essentially to the power of the monarch, right? And the monarch, back when we didn't have things like a strong Bill of Rights in the UK, way before we have the American system that we think about either in the colonial times or today, was obviously the monarch, right? The supreme power could search and could have the people that worked for the monarch search your property and search your house. There's no warrants to think about the way that we think of them now. And as the parliament became more and more powerful, the parliament started asserting more and more authority of how that looked. And in many ways, you see in about the 1660s, this creation of the writ of assistance, not completely, but close. And then in 1662, in the Act of Preventing Frauds, you see the creation essentially of what these writs look like, which is a general search warrant. They were not particularized. They did not necessarily describe the space where law enforcement could search or what law enforcement might be looking for. And in 16, I think 96, these were extended to the United States, to the colonies at that point, to the Americas. And it's really important to note where this grows out of. It grows out of customs officials, and it grows out in many ways of customs officials searching for contraband. And think about this when we think about the early American colonies. At the very early start, that's a huge place where trade is happening, where some of the most prominent to become Americans are involved in trade between both the colonies and abroad. And you can famously begin to see, especially when it comes to the Townshend Acts in 1767, and John Hancock famously started fighting against these generalized warrants, that the colonies felt very strongly when it came to enacting both. I think about 5 state constitutions early on had something that began to limit the power of the warrant and limit the power of law enforcement, which then ends up being reflected in the Fourth Amendment and what we talked about before, persons, houses, papers, and effects, and the importance of describing a particular place to be searched and what folks are looking for. And I think it's important to have this background because we have a huge attachment in the United States to this idea of privacy, this idea of liberty, and especially when it comes to one's home and one's things. But there isn't actually a privacy right in the Constitution specifically the way that we might think that there would be. Unlike in Europe, where you absolutely can find the right to privacy in a much more clear fashion, this is part of what makes this balance so important. It's part of what makes this balance, I wouldn't say complicated, but really nuanced. And I think that's why I wanted to open with a little bit of that background, because as we quickly zoom all the way up to today to start to look at these same questions that come up, these Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment questions haven't changed that much. Now, obviously, a lot of things have changed. I'm sure U.S. Attorney Bacon and U.S. Attorney Gonzalez would be the first that would tell you that cell phones and technology have made a huge difference in the way the Fourth Amendment would look versus how it would obviously look when we have the Constitution enacted in 1787 and then the amendments in the next few years. So with that, I wanted to start with that legal framework and I turn it over to, I think, U.S. Attorney Gonzalez to kind of talk a little bit about what I've mentioned, and then thinking about, I think, Title III and the Dutch wiretap authority to give even more background of how our laws are a byproduct of past actions.
Well, Christopher, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come ahead and speak with everyone. It's really going to be a good conversation that I'm looking forward to. But all of this really boils down to, like you alluded, the laws of a particular country, generally speaking, have to do with the past of that country. As reflected in what was going on, taking it way back to 1215 and the signing of the Magna Carta, which is where, the land barons at the time demanded protections from the sovereign, from King John. And you have that evolution of laws being a reflection of what is going on in the country. And when we were speaking earlier, I draw the analogy, being a former drug prosecutor, to the wiretap laws of the United States. The very first wiretap in the United States was conducted in 1895 in New York City. And it was a former telephone operator who joined the New York Police Department and said, hey, bad guys are using the phones. Why don't we just listen to their conversations? And sure enough, that was done, and the conversations were captured. It was first brought to the attention of the courts. I think it was 1928, Roy Olmsted, which was a bootlegger in Seattle, had his conversations recorded, and he went ahead and said, wait a minute, that should not be allowed. I have a privacy interest in my conversations. And the Supreme Court said, no, you don't. And the conviction was upheld, stating that there was no expectation of privacy in these telephone conversations. So wiretaps have been going on for a long time. You fast forward to around 1963, then Attorney General Robert Kennedy was authorizing the FBI to go ahead and break into the home and the offices of Martin Luther King and plant room bugs and intercept his telephone conversations. And that's pretty much at the point where U.S. society as a whole said, wait a minute, this is getting out of control. We need to go ahead and enact legislation to limit the government's authority to go ahead and intercept these phone calls, something that's been going on for decades upon decades upon decades. So in 1968, the first wiretap laws were enacted, which was the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, and that's where the Congress first said, no, if you're going to conduct a wiretap, here is this series of things that you have to do, law enforcement, before you have an opportunity to tap someone's communications. And that's where that privacy right in communications came in. And I think, again, it being a reflection of what's going on in society, you talked about the need to go ahead and get a warrant to conduct a search in someone's house. The steps you have to show to get a wiretap are so much more than that. I mean, your search at a house is really a probable cause standard. The standard for a wiretap is that you have exhausted all other investigative means, or they are too dangerous or would be completely fruitless. That is one of the hurdles you have to meet before you can get a wiretap. There's a whole series of other hurdles on top of that. It has to be done under the supervision of the court. There has to be real-time monitoring. Particularity, you have to state what are the crimes that you are intercepting. And if a conversation occurs that is not about that crime, you have to turn off the machine. You can't record, you can't listen to it. You can periodically turn it on to see if the conversation has changed. There are reports to the court that although not in the statute, it's pretty much widely done by the prosecutors, to continue these authorizations, and they're only good for a very short set period of time. So again, it's a reflection of what happens in society, where you had this investigative tool that was never regulated, that the Supreme Court said didn't need to be regulated. And as the abuses continued, it got to the point where society as a whole, through the legislature, said enough is enough. We need to go ahead and stop that. And you contrast that, because I've worked a lot of international cases, and just coincidentally, I've worked a lot of cases with the authorities in the Netherlands and Holland, and their wiretap laws are completely different from the United States because they don't have that background. It wasn't until 2000 that they had any legislation in terms of what was needed to go ahead and conduct a wiretap. And it was, preparing for this, I came across something very interesting, that if you look at the countries that conduct the most wiretaps per capita, number one is Italy, number two is the Netherlands. And the Netherlands conduct, I think the statistic that was given in what I was reading was 62 wiretaps per 100,000 inhabitants. And by contrast, the United States is 0.5 wiretaps per 100,000. And that study, was commenting that every year, well in excess of 10,000 wiretaps conducted in the Netherlands yield no evidence at all that can be used at trial. It's almost the de facto first step. But there, Dutch society does not place that privacy interest in communications that we have in the United States. And that's always the way it's been. And it wasn't until 2000 that they even had a legislature. And really that legislature addressed more electronic communications than the traditional telephone, pick up the phone, wiretap communications.
That's a fascinating, U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, fascinating. And it's interesting to think about how we place such a special view on privacy in this country. I mean, the Fourth Amendment really is a reflection on our experiences. And I love how you brought in looking at, the way in which other countries look at this as well, because they don't think about this in the American context. And they don't think about this the way that we try to balance this. And U.S. Attorney Bacon, are there other places that we can find within regulations and procedures where this balance plays out in especially the Department of Justice?
Yes, absolutely. And really, Tony hit on it when he said that one reason we went down this path as a country is that things were getting a little aggressive, and there was pushback, and there was thought that this tool was being abused. And so one important step that the Department of Justice has taken is they've added a layer of policy. So it's not constitutionally required. It might not be statutorily required, but we're saying as a department, when we're looking to get this balance right, what are the other safeguards or steps that should be in place in order to achieve what we are trying to achieve in America? And so for one example is when you're a baby prosecutor, you are quickly shown the Department of Justice manual, which has multiple chapters, is very thick. We are cautioned not to print it because it's so thick. It's available online, but it goes through and catalogs all of the different safeguards. And so to give you an example, from the time that you want to open a case through the time that you either believe the case should be dismissed or charges should be brought, there are layers of review. And so that means it's not one prosecutor's decision or one agent's decision, but along the way, you have steps, you have checks and balances, you have ways to make sure that the processes we're following and the tools we're using achieve the goal that you were trying to say, which is getting that balance right? Making sure that we get evidence to prevent crime, because we don't want victims of crime, but also respecting individual rights and liberties. So for example, search warrants. Tony mentioned the standard for a search warrant is probable cause. But let's say hypothetically, there was evidence that an attorney was stealing money from her clients, embezzling from the client trust account, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And these were from senior citizens. These were people who this was their life savings. So it's terrible, it's despicable. And so the FBI says, I want to go into the law office and I want to search for the records that'll show that this was the client's money. Well, that's very sensitive going into a law firm, going into an attorney's office. There are client confidences in that office. There are secrets and privileges between the attorney and the attorney's legitimate clients. And so the department, through policy, puts in extra safeguards. But they're not in the Constitution, they're not in the statutes, but they're another set of rules that in that particular instance would require approval from somebody at Main Justice in Washington, D.C. So it's not even within the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's someone in Washington, D.C. in addition will review the probable cause and will determine whether or not that's an appropriate step in the case. And so that's an example of how it's not, we don't just look to the Constitution when we're looking at law enforcement and how we enforce the laws, but we're also taking this other policy step, which is just because you can do it, should you do it? You can, but should you? And this layer is designed to achieve that balance. Is it a case where this should be a step that we're taking or a tool we should be using?
And so in many ways, I think, as you just mentioned, U.S. Attorney Bacon, you've got these constitutional safeguards that folks talk about all the time. But at the same time, you have all these other layers of safeguards that really look at ensuring that there's a uniform process and procedure. And I think that example you use is excellent because you're absolutely right. There's a whole different procedure that can exist when you have something that's as sensitive as an attorney's office. That can come and be, you can have something outlined so that you have a procedure to follow in order to ensure that it's not even just the Fourth, Fifth, or Sixth Amendments, that there's additional guarantees of protection.
That's right. It's very important. And I think it's important because media changes so quickly. And I don't mean media in terms of the press. I mean media in terms of, we used to have mimeograph when I was in school, and then we got fax machines, and then we had scanners, and now we just take pictures of things. And so it takes a long time for a constitution to address all of these different changes in how we communicate. And that's where these policies come in, that they're ensuring that we are keeping up and we are consistent with the goals that we want, which is, again, striking that balance of ensuring that we are keeping people safe. We don't have crime victims, but we're also respecting that individuals' liberties.
Well, and especially as you've mentioned, we can think about this. A lot of the Fourth and Fifth and Sixth Amendment cases at the U.S. Supreme Court are dealing with things that they could not have possibly imagined back when these amendments were put into place, and we're dealing with real world examples. And you can think about cell phones on, and how cell phones have made a huge shift when it comes to thinking about the Fourth Amendment. And I know obviously have played a big role when it comes to law enforcement. And this is a dynamic process. We constantly have to be thinking about striking these appropriate balances. And U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, you've had so many instances to think about this, from the violent gang violence and drug interdiction and everything that you've seen, both as a state prosecutor and federal prosecutor. And how have you thought about some of these balances yourself?
Well, it's the balances and it's the challenges, and you hit it on the head with the new technology. So, traditionally you think of a phone as a closed container, right? And you get a warrant to go into the phone and look for the evidence that you're looking for. Okay, well, the phone is encrypted. Do you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in what your face looks like? Can law enforcement hold the phone up to your face so that it unlocks? Well, maybe, I don't know. What about biometrics? Do you have an expectation of privacy on your fingerprints that you leave all over the world on everything that you touch? Can law enforcement have you put your finger on the home button of your iPhone, thereby unlocking it? Can you be forced to give up the password? So all of these things are things that never in a million years would have crossed the mind of the framers of the Constitution or, the authors of the Bill of Rights that we're now grappling with. And the law is always going to be behind technology. That's just always been the case. But technology has also never advanced as fast as it has now. So you have cutting edge law that is addressing technologies that became obsolete 5 years ago. So you're left to strike these balances and to a certain extent, guess to the best of your abilities, well, what would the Supreme Court say 5, 6 years from now, when, if we're successful, this case ever gets in front of the Supreme Court? You know, there's no playbook for it. So, you know, you're left to do the best you can. You're left to, try to rely on the case law as much as you can, and you rely on, Department of Justice policy. As Tony was describing the search warrant on the lawyer's office, she got only halfway through the process, because once you meet all of those requirements and that warrant is signed, she's not going into the office and her agents are not going into the office, but a privileged set of agents and prosecutors are going to go in there, seize all the evidence. They're going to go through the evidence. They have nothing to do with her investigation and only give her what is relevant and never talk to her about all of the other stuff. So again, that's not, codified in the Bill of Rights or in the Constitution or anything like that, but there are steps that are taken trying to look forward to what will happen in the future when those things are litigated.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And it obviously looks so different. And U.S. Attorney Bacon, I love how you brought up the fax machine, because it's such a different way to think about how the Fourth Amendment really interacts versus, what you just said, U.S. Attorney Gonzalez. I mean, some of the technology that, I even remember, thinking about, sending subpoenas to Facebook. And that was like a new thing to do when Facebook had just come out, and people not recognizing that it's probably not the best idea to post things publicly, because you're going to find out about it if you do something like that. And the way in which technology has had that impact, and either U.S. Attorney Bacon or U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, as we look at this dynamic process, and think about expand your experiences when it comes to violent crimes or drugs or the national security space, are there things that come to mind that we should share, or we might want to share with the audience that help explain the real world impact of some of these questions?
Tony, if you want to take that, or if not, I'll go ahead and I'll address it, because I think we both have experiences that bring this really home.
Well, why don't you go first and then I'll follow up with mine.
Fair enough. What we have really is a balance between law enforcement trying to do the right thing and Joe citizen who wants them to do the right thing, but I'm the wrong guy that they're doing it to. And striking that balance, and the one that always hits home to me is, I have become very close friends of all of the agents, the TSA agents at Miami International Airport. And it's not because I work cases there, but it's because my name is Juan Gonzalez, as are 4 or 5 people on the no-fly list. And when I fly into Miami International Airport, don't worry about the fact that I am the acting U.S. attorney, or that I have an official passport, or that I have my credentials, or that I'm traveling with 4 DEA agents. Guess who's going to secondary, because his name is Juan Gonzalez? That would be me. And that pretty much happens every single time I leave the country and fly back into Miami International Airport. And it's law enforcement trying to do their job to the best of their abilities with faulty information. And then it becomes a challenge of, how do you better that situation so that you're not impeding on the rights of the public, but at the same time protecting that same public from evildoers?
That's absolutely right. And I've had similar examples. So my background, my father's side of the family is Lebanese. And I had the great privilege of joining the Department of Justice the day after 9/11. And it was a horrible time for the country. I think everyone remembers where they were when that happened. We all remember watching the horrible video. And I was so proud to start at the department, because I wanted to be part of helping make America safe, keep America safe, and just have it so we could go outside again and not worry about what was going to happen. And what I found is that there were many dedicated, committed people, exactly like Tony said. They don't want another incident like that to happen ever again. And they were so focused on it. And I don't think they ever woke up in the morning and said, what can I do to make Tony's life miserable? Or how can I target her? It came from a place of where my heart came from, which is, how do we make America safe? But as I started to travel with the department, I had very similar experiences. We made a lot of last minute one-way reservations, going place to place to place for grand juries or to interview people. I traveled without a lot of baggage. I fit a lot of what the typology was for people who at that time were engaged in that conduct. And I got stopped. Not once, not twice, every single time. Every single time. And I was told it was a random selection or a special selection. And we all know that my name was probably, my maiden name was not Bacon, that's my married name. So we know that there were some other factors that played into it. And I think what I came out of that experience from, and I'm really grateful for it, because it's a way to truly understand both sides of this very important issue. I knew the importance that we have to do everything we can to protect our borders. And I also saw the impact of some policies and how they affect individuals. And not just me, but family and friends or others at the airport who saw that and saw what was happening. And so bringing that together, I think, makes me a better prosecutor. Because as we see issues, and that's just one issue, but when you talk about the balance, that history and that experience reminds me that with every policy, we need to stop and consider, how do people view that policy? How will people be affected by the policy? And that really is the core of the debate. And coming at it with an attitude not of, again, they're waking up trying to figure out how I'm going to mess up Tony for this day, but how we can really refine the information, as Tony, you said, help refine what we're looking for, and as a community, come together and as a community help identify who are the criminals, and let's find those, and for everyone else, let them enjoy life.
Right.
Oh, please.
Just to interrupt and to go back to the theme of how laws and law enforcement and the way privacy is viewed as a reflection of what happens in society. You know, in 1968, you had the wiretap statute that was drafted. It wasn't touched until right after September 11th with the USA Patriot Act that went ahead and eased up a lot of the restrictions on wiretaps. And it's the pendulum swinging the other way. You know, it's here, you know, we need to protect these privacy rights. And then something as horrible as the September 11th attacks happen. And then all of a sudden the pendulum swings. Wait a minute, maybe it's okay to give up some of those liberties. Maybe it's okay to be searched a little more in the airport. Maybe the government should be able to go ahead and a little easier get those wiretaps, because it's a reflection of what's going on in society and what is society willing to give up in exchange for that protection.
I think that was so brilliantly put, and you know, it makes me think about it. And I'm watching some of the questions, and I can see how I want to frame some of this, because I think we all can look at and see a rise in, you know, domestic violent extremism, and there are really historic levels of violent crime across America's cities. I mean, U.S. Attorney Bacon, you and I have had, you know, conversations about that where it's just it's heartbreaking to see certain instances happen, and try as you can as a prosecutor to do what you can to prevent those types of things from happening. And we've got pandemic relief fraud. I've seen some of the cases that have been coming out, and they're just shocking when you think about what happens when you put so much money into the system, and that people will take advantage of really needed relief at a time like this pandemic. And it makes me think that while there appears to be this question of law enforcement and a trust or mistrust of law enforcement in some communities, how do we strike that balance, and how do we ensure that we are, protecting the public? I mean, that really is the role of law enforcement, but especially a prosecutor, right? Is to do justice, is to do the right thing. And I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on that at a moment like today, when we see some of these things, and I know people are asking some questions about it.
I think it starts with what you're doing right here, and that is, it needs to start with a dialogue and communication. And this is something the Department of Justice has been really, I've seen an evolution from the time I was a baby prosecutor and back in 2001 till now, that there's a real emphasis on, engaging with the community. We actually have positions in every U.S. Attorney's office just for community outreach. And in many offices, in mine, it's not a lawyer. It's someone who comes from the community and is engaged in the community. And the goal is this, it's to hear from the community, what are you seeing are the biggest crime threats? What are the problems that you're facing? How can we help make your life better? Because as you said, we're the Department of Justice. We just want the communities to be safe and for people to live their lives without worry about being victims of crimes, right? And at the same time, we share with the community, here are the threats we're seeing. These are what the threats look like. And here are some strategies or some ways that we're thinking about approaching the problem, and we're approaching the problem. And it's having that kind of honest dialogue. And it has to be a dialogue because as Tony mentioned, that the threats are changing and the pendulum changes. You know, we are at record levels of violent crime here in Northern New York. We had a 12-year-old a few weeks ago shot with a bullet that came through his house when he was home just doing homework. He's paralyzed. It's completely unacceptable. It has to end. We cannot have violent shootings, across the streets all summer long. So what's the answer? And I think that answer starts with each community engaging in this dialogue and saying, what is our crime problem? What are the tools we have? What are the strategies? And have that open discussion about where should our balance be in our community for this particular time.
Right. And just to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, I come from a large office and we service a very large geographic area. So we have an entire team of people that do the community outreach. But to do the community outreach, you have to become part of the community. You can't just show up when there's a problem or when you need something. You can't just pick up the phone when you want something. You have to really be an integral part in the community and participate in things in the community, which we strive to do, whether it's, food banks, whether it's going out to the schools, and you need to be able to help that community. They need to know that if they want to have a rally someplace and they're getting a hard time from their local authorities to get that permit to have that rally, they can reach out to us and we can help them do that. That they can come to us when they have problems that we can help with, and not just us going to them when we perceive their community has a problem that we want to go ahead and address. Anecdotally, we had a lot of civil unrest lately, and a lot of cities dealt with a lot of very serious consequences as a result of that. Miami had its issues as well, but nowhere near to the extent that other large cities throughout the country had. And I think that is a product of our history, because if you go back to the 80s, there were significant racial problems, racial protests, and riots in Miami. And we learned from that as a community. And that's really when, way back then, we began integrating into these communities, having these open dialogues with them. They know who to call in our office. We know who to call in the different communities, whether it's particular neighborhoods, faith-based communities, whatever the case may be. So we had that open dialogue, and the overwhelming majority of the rallies and the protests that took place in South Florida, thankfully were very peaceful. Many of them, were resolved without any issues whatsoever, and people had an opportunity to champion their cause, and it was done in a harmonious way. But that's because, for decades we have been integrating in that community and have become part of the community. And even within our own community in the office, there were people that shared similar sentiments and were angered about what they were seeing.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that we were even talking a little bit about before is as much as people think about law enforcement when it comes to police or other law enforcement agencies, people sometimes forget the incredibly important role, that absolutely central role that a prosecutor plays. A prosecutor, it has that interest of justice. And U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, I love what you said about being in the community, because it allows for you to have your finger on the pulse of what's actually happening, and being able to have those open dialogues and discussions in order to try and do what you can to make that difference possible.
Sure. I mean, and it's work. There's no doubt about it, but you get to see the benefits of that. Whether it's something as large as what we had with the civil unrest, to something as small as calls into tip lines and things like that. to help law enforcement in their investigations. So there's a lot of it. There's a lot of involvement.
And recruiting. I think an important part of this is the recruitment, that when you're out in the community and young people see that there's so many facets to the Department of Justice, and that crime prevention is really the core of what we do. I mean, we don't want crimes. We want to deter. We want to prevent. And they see that there are so many wonderful opportunities to help their community through this type of work. And so I think the outreach is very important, just in terms of the pipeline of future servant leaders and future law enforcement agents who want to make a difference in their communities.
Oh, that's so beautifully put. And, it's interesting. I just see a question pop up that I'm going to help answer, and certainly feel free to jump in and comment, talking about how far does the law go when attempting to gain access to information? Is there a limit where the law can throw, at least in this question, ethics out the window? And I think actually U.S. Attorney Bacon and U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, you've actually shown that it goes so much further than just quote unquote statute or quote unquote constitution when it comes to ensuring that ethics is always front and center when it comes to looking at a particular case. Because as U.S. Attorney Bacon, you mentioned, you have policies and procedures that we can't even print out because there's too many of them and we don't want to waste all of that ink, right? And so if anything, I actually think it's incredible, absolutely incredible to see how much structure there is in the system when it comes to constitutional protections and norms, statutory protections and norms, and procedural and policy protections and norms. And I'm not saying anything's perfect, but between that and dialogue and community engagement, there's an incredible amount in that system.
That's right. I'm so glad you mentioned ethics, because we are not measured as prosecutors in wins or losses. We are never judged on that. You're judged on, did you do justice? Mm-hmm. Did you do the right thing? And doing the right thing means doing it the right way every day, right? And once that is just the core principle of what we do. We have ethics officers in every U.S. attorney's office and at Main Justice. And that's really an important part of it, because we want to make sure that what we're doing it the right way.
Absolutely. And I have no doubt that the three of us can all think of a time we've walked into a courtroom and dropped a case because we realized this is not a case that we should be involved in. And we followed constitutional norms and statutory norms and procedural norms to come to that conclusion. It's part of, like you said, seeking justice, which is really central. And I'm curious with U.S. Attorney Gonzalez and U.S. Attorney Bacon, coming back to this question of community, because I think this is really important. How do we maintain that dialogue and respect as prosecutors with the community? What are some of those tools that the two of you have used over the years to ensure that those lines of communication are as open as possible to try to, make sure to prevent the shooting that you mentioned, U.S. Attorney Bacon, or prevent some of the interdictive work that you've done, U.S. Attorney Gonzalez?
Well, I mean, let me jump on this first, Tony. One of the things that I think is very important, and one of the things that we strive really hard to do, is our office should be a reflection of our community. It shouldn't be, just a collection of people, that are all, these Ivy League white guys in suits, deciding what cases get prosecuted. And, it's very, very important that our office reflect our community in terms of diversity of all different kinds, because those prosecutors bring with them their experiences and how they grew up and in what they as members of a particular community experienced. And therefore, makes it a lot easier for them to A, communicate with others in that community, but B, and equally important as your role as a prosecutor, I'm sorry, something doesn't smell right here, Mr. Police Officer. Something is not, my spidey sense is tingling that the story you're telling me may not necessarily be the way that it happened out there, because that's not my experience, and that's not what I believe to be the case, and that's not what I've seen to happen in the past. So bringing in that diversity in the office, I think, helps a lot. When people from the community can speak to others within our office that are reflective of that community. And it also brings in a wealth of information, just in terms of people's backgrounds as to what's going on in the world.
And I think that that's so important because it also brings, to the forefront cultural sensitivity and awareness. So kind of going back to the example of TSA, and I love TSA. I don't want to say that I feel bad using them as the example. We could use someone else, another screening example. But I was raised in a culture where you take your hat off when you walk into a building. It is rude to sit and walk into a building and you have your hat on. And so people who are raised maybe similarly wouldn't think it's a big deal to ask someone to take their hat off. It's like, what's the big deal? One, you're being rude if you don't, but two, it's not that inconvenient. But as you have interactions and work with and travel and start to appreciate that in some cultures, taking your hat off is considered rude. And that it would be very insulting to ask someone to take their hat, or I should head covering off. And so it's just understanding that when you work with a diverse workforce, when you're in the community and you're learning about different cultures, or you're traveling and you're appreciating and understanding differences, it helps you revisit your policies and practice so that when we are engaging with the public, we're not doing things that are automatically triggers or red flags or just reinforce like completely false premises, but the notions that they don't care or they're being rude when really it's just a lack of understanding. And so part of, I think, the community engagement, as Tony said, is being in the community to learn differences, to learn how can we have better interactions? How can we change our tone? How can we change our approach so that we are being respectful of people's traditions that might be different from ours?
Well, it goes, if I can interject, even deeper than that. I mean, in the Hispanic community, when you are addressing an individual of authority, you look at them square in the eye and you have that conversation. But in the Haitian community, that's considered very rude, and you do not look at a person of authority in the eyes when you speak to them. So you have, hypothetically, a Hispanic prosecutor who doesn't know that to be the case, and they are having a conversation with a witness from the Haitian community, and they're thinking to themselves, this guy's lying to me. He won't even look me in the face when he's telling me what he purportedly saw. So those cultural sensitivities, go, I think, even far beyond whether you're going to insult someone by telling them to take off their hat. They may very well affect your ability to gauge credibility and make decisions as to whether or not a case should go forward or a witness is telling you the truth.
And I want to note something that I know that the three of us have talked about before, because I see us kind of circling these words, the idea of tone and tenure, right? Tone and tenure make a difference when it comes to these communications and to setting those expectations, especially as a leading prosecutor, because people look up to the position and expect that tone and tenure. How do the two of you think and feel about how important that is to what we've just been talking about?
It's absolutely the starting point. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely the starting point of where we have to be. And that's, we have, law enforcement's a community problem, right? Crime's a community problem. And it's something that one person can't solve or one group can't solve. It really takes every single person coming together and wanting to make the community safer and better. And part of, leadership is being the first one to start with the right tone and tenor and start with the olive branch and be the one to take the first step. And that's something we embrace. And that's why the department has funded law enforcement coordinator positions and public outreach positions. And that you could see from Main Justice, it's such an important part, a really central part of our mission is to make sure that we are out there engaged in the community and are trying to have, exactly like you said, that type of respectful dialogue so that we can solve these problems and work together.
Right. You have to get out into the community. You have to have those dialogues, but physically getting out there and having the conversation is only part of it. You have to have the right attitude. You have to have the right level of respect. It's very easy to go into the community and say, I know what your problem is and I know how to solve it. And that's going to get you nowhere. I mean, you need to take a big dose of humility and realize guy who's been studying this problem for 2 weeks, don't have the slightest idea of what people have been living through for the past 20 years in a particular community. Maybe you need to take a step back, be a little more humble and listen before you open your mouth and you start telling people what their problems are and how you intend to fix them.
Oh, that's so well put. And, interestingly enough, I see a question that's popped up, and U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, you may be perfectly positioned to answer this because of your experience from both the state and federal level, but also U.S. Attorney Bacon. I can only imagine how much you liaised with the local prosecutors, especially when you were in Cleveland. But one of the things that doesn't make sense to a lot of folks on the outside is the role that the federal prosecutors play versus state prosecutors, and how incredibly complicated that can be at certain points, and also at certain points be actually quite simple. And I see this question of the involvement of local issues and how that can be impacted as a federal prosecutor, but also the importance that, as the question asks, U.S. attorneys aren't supposed to be local law enforcers. No, but in so many ways, that doesn't change the role and the importance of being that community voice, that community liaison, that face that can set that tone. And U.S. Attorney Gonzalez or U.S. Attorney Bacon, I mean, you've had so many experiences in this realm. What strikes you about that unique relationship between the state and federal level?
Tony, if you want to take it, if not, I'll be more than happy to, being the former state prosecutor.
You can both.
Well, as a state prosecutor, in Miami, my client is the people of the state of Florida. As a federal prosecutor, my client are, the citizens of the United States of America, which also includes the people of the state of Florida, by the way. So you go to the way the framework is, we typically think of a local crime as something that would normally be prosecuted by the local prosecutor's office. And that is, more often than not the case. But there are times when local crimes affect the federal interest. And the federal government can go ahead and step in, either because they are the only ones who can prosecute the crime, or because they can augment the law enforcement and the crime fighting that's already being handled by the locals and the state authorities. And we are not in competition with the state. Believe me, there's more than enough crime to go around. There's more than enough bad guys to go around. But the way I like to see it is, we have a symbiotic relationship with the state where we help each other out. And sometimes there are local problems that also have a federal impact. And if that's the case, we will work collaboratively to go ahead and solve that. I mean, there's countless state, federal, local task forces addressing different problems, where you have both state and federal prosecutors working on it, as well as state, local, and federal law enforcement that are working on it. And in my particular case, my last 4 years in the state attorney's office, I was also cross-designated as a special assistant U.S. attorney, and I was prosecuting, even though I was a state prosecutor, federal cases in federal court on behalf of the federal government. Sometimes it's as easy as where the crime took place, because a guy walks into a post office and steals the mail. That's a federal crime. That one, that's an easy one. And there are other times where it becomes a little bit more complicated. So those are things that are worked out depending on the individual facts of the case and what happened and where it happened.
And really to dovetail on Tony's comment and to give an example to the listeners, what might start out, my background is in elder fraud and elder justice, and we have these horrible robocall scams that are targeting the elderly. And so the local prosecutor's office might start to see it first. Complaints from citizens coming in saying, I got a call. They said they were from Social Security. They were going to shut off my account if I didn't pay, so I sent $500. And so it's a $500 theft, which is something that would be handled locally because there are local victims. Well, then they start to see 5, 10, 20 victims, and not just in one county, but in the adjoining county, and then the county north, and then the county west, and you start to realize this is bigger. And that's when we might get involved, because the federal government has the ability to issue process across counties, across states, and work with our international counterparts to see maybe there are wrongdoers or there's evidence abroad. And so working through the State Department and through the diplomatic process and MLAT process, mutual legal assistance treaty process, to get that evidence. So there's an example of how we might work collectively, that there might be some matters that start at the state, and then if they turn out to be something that's beyond the state's jurisdiction, that would come to us, so that we might then continue to work together so that we can make sure that we're stopping the harm and trying to maximize the restitution we're able to get back to those victims.
And it's amazing to hear what you both said, because I can't even think myself back to the time at the State Liquor Authority, where you would think you wouldn't encounter too many crazy things, but I assure you that in the alcoholic beverage control trade, you encounter everything that is crazy. And I can even think myself about, running into things very simple, bar inspections that turn into human trafficking investigations. And the first thing you do is call the U.S. Attorney's Office because you want to make sure that you are working together. You want to make sure that you do have the resources and the availability of lots of eyes on things. And I think coming back to what this looks like, in many ways, it's much more collaborative than maybe it may look like from the outside, where people are frequently trying to work together. Because as you said, U.S. Attorney Bacon, oftentimes things can start small, but those patterns can cross state lines, and it becomes very important to ensure that jurisdictionally you can have that impact on a larger scale.
Well, and that really helps you understand what is the crime problem in the community.
Yes.
Right. And it's understanding the patterns and seeing, criminals don't look at the state boundaries or even a city boundary and say, oh, I'm only going to stay in this city. That is not my experience. They are opportunists. And so it's having these relationships within the different communities. You start to hear patterns of things that are happening that might be small in each isolated instance, but when put together, you realize this is a real problem for the region. And it's a problem that maybe we can help address. And that human trafficking example you gave is a great one. Mm-hmm. So let me draw it out for you. And Tony might have examples of this in Florida. You're out in the community and you're asking, what are the problems? What are you hearing? And they're like, the real issue is there's a hotel down the street, mm-hmm. and people are coming and going all times of the night, and all these young girls, and they're making a lot of noise. And to the neighbors, the noise is the problem. The coming and going is a problem. And it's a true nuisance. It's really bothering. But we start to hear that and we're like, something's going on at that hotel. And so then you start to look into it. And just like you said, it could be human trafficking. Mm-hmm. It could be crimes against children that are happening in that particular place. And then you start to look at that and talk to other communities and you're like, wait a minute, similar hotels, similar problems. Or you might notice that there's a unique car that shows up at 4 or 5 different places, and you don't get that information unless you're out in the community. Mm-hmm. And you're listening to people's problems, you're taking them seriously. And as Tony said, you're trying to help. Noise violations at the hotel down the street are not a federal crime, but by trying to help, what we discovered are real victims who need help. These are vulnerable women and children who are being trafficked and sold. And that is a federal crime. That is something that we should be focused on. And so it's that type of community partnership that at the end of the day helps everybody in the community. And that's what we're out there trying to do.
There are so many examples of big, gigantic federal cases that all started because of a local police officer stopping a car, or a tip to a tip line for some innocuous crime that then just gets built upon and built upon and built upon and built upon. And before you know it, you have some large international criminal conspiracy that's going on. It's really amazing how interwoven these things are, and how, and you see this particularly when you do organized crime cases like I did in RICO investigations, how you go back historically and you see these discrete little cases that were handled by local authorities that now that you're looking from up high, you see the interrelationship between all of them, and how one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another.
It's so well put. And it actually brings me all the way back to thinking about the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment And just thinking about it, one of the reasons that I used to get called in was because if you had a liquor license, your premise had waived your Fourth Amendment rights. So I could always inspect a premise. I always had the opportunity to do that because of the way that a liquor license looks as a privilege as opposed to just like a driver's license. And so it frequently allowed me to have a chance, and my folks to have a chance to look at things a little bit different and to work with folks more generally. And it makes me think of the importance of that community. I'm so glad that we had, and I focused so much on the question of community, and a question that's come up, and I'm certainly happy to take the first pass myself, about the tensions that may exist between law enforcement officers, defense attorneys, prosecutors, when it comes to being culturally representative, but and also maybe not culturally representative of the community, and what that tug of war looks like. And I can even say this for myself. I was the first LGBTQ general counsel of the State Liquor Authority. And something that historically folks might not know is it's the State Liquor Authority that caused Stonewall, which is the big kickoff to the LGBTQ rights movement. It was the State Liquor Authority that raided with the police the bar, and they did so under a statute that I still interpreted when I was the general counsel. It's still on the books. And it was an incredible experience to be the first person to sit in the seat. And there were lots of very interesting things that came from being the first person to sit in the actual seat that caused, in many ways, the civil rights movement for the LGBTQ world. And there's definitely interesting tensions that would come up from that I had to navigate. But at the same time, I actually felt very responsible, because I thought it was really critical that representation existed because of the community discussions we've just had, because it's so important when you're out in the community and building those relationships for people to see that there are people that have the same experiences that they've had in life, that are in those posts and able to now make those decisions and make them different than were made when my predecessor's predecessor decided to not let LGBTQ people go to bars. And I think that's an incredible arc when it comes to the community and the actual seeking of justice.
Well, you can't overlook the fact that we are part of the community as well.
Mm-hmm.
And things that happen in the community affect us as prosecutors. We don't live in a bubble. Recently there was a program that I was watching, which was absolutely fascinating. And it talked about Black police officers and their response to the George Floyd tragedy. And, I am a police officer, here I am, but I'm also a Black male, and I'm seeing police officers do this type of activity. We don't live in a vacuum. I am a Cuban American, and I was a federal prosecutor when, if you remember way back when, Elian Gonzalez, who was picked up on a raft floating in the ocean and brought to his family in Miami, the Department of Justice made the decision, no, we're going to physically take him from his family and send him back to his father in Cuba. And, those are things that, as a member of that community, strike me as well.
No, I think that's very, very true. And I see, a question that is specific, and I'm going to broaden it out just a little bit, because I think it comes back to this community question. And somebody's asked about how different offices and different experiences you may have had when it comes to working collaborative with different levels of law enforcement. When it comes to, in this particular question, I'm just going to say larger views of terrorism or issues in the international sphere, and how to balance some of those civil liberties that we were talking about. And I think in many ways, the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, as we know, look different on U.S. soil than they necessarily do when you're not on U.S. soil. And I don't know if U.S. Attorney Bacon, if that's something that you might want to comment on, or U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, that's something that you might want to comment on, because we're always kind of balancing these Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment questions, and that's obviously something that U.S. Attorney Bacon, you mentioned, days after 9/11, the department obviously made a shift to prioritize ensuring that we are looking at national security and protecting our national interest.
No, you're right, and that's extremely important, right? Protecting national security is job number one, right? We have to keep our people safe and our community safe. And I think we could have a whole webinar on foreign evidence and the discussion of what that looks like. I think Tony and I both have had experience trying to, from working with Canada to Mexico to, I actually had an extradition out of Madagascar, which was fascinating. It was a lawyer who embezzled money from his client's trust account and fled the country, and we tracked him. There's some great collaborative work to Madagascar, and we're able to bring him back. So there are, definitely for a different day and a longer discussion, all of the navigation to do, because certainly the principles that apply here, there's some strong considerations to that with respect to, can you use the evidence when you get it back, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is a great question and probably a good topic for you for 2022 webinar series.
No, that's absolutely true. And somebody actually asked a very simple question, and I'm not sure if either of you want to comment on this. And I want to make sure that we keep framing this in the community context. But somebody's asked about the impact of the exclusionary rule and how that operates. And just very briefly, generally speaking, the exclusionary rule says that if you've obtained evidence in a way that doesn't comport with the Constitution, that you cannot use that evidence in a courtroom. I'm being very general because we've all had experience.
That's a great summary.
Yeah, I'm trying to be
an overview of it. And I have an interesting, well, maybe I find it an interesting story, but a story on this. So we had a case, and the allegation was that it was a rape case many years ago. And the allegation was that the police improperly searched a vehicle and obtained what happened to be the evidence that was used for the DNA sample that was going to match. And we litigated it. We thought it was a good search. At the end of the day, we were told it was not a good search. We respect the court's decision. And so that means we couldn't use the evidence, which means we did not have sufficient evidence to bring the case. And I had to sit down with the crime victim after that and explain to this crime victim who she was raped. The evidence showed we was raped, but we could not use the evidence. And the exclusionary rule is very difficult to explain to crime victims who said, I didn't do anything wrong. I was victimized. He could hurt someone else again, and he can go free, so that it's a deterrent to others. And that's a very difficult concept, I think, for a crime victim to understand. And that the idea of the exclusionary rule is, we understand police make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes every day. That is just a matter of life. We're all human. But what we want to do is, the idea of the exclusionary rule is saying when police make certain types of mistakes, the penalty or the remedy is you cannot use the evidence. And the idea is then other police officers will stop, they'll listen, they'll learn, they'll train, because no one wants to have to tell a crime victim, have that conversation that I had to have with that young woman. And so it is a difficult concept, it's a challenging concept, but it's an important concept, because at the end of the day, it is yet another check. It's yet another way that we are ensuring that law enforcement is following the rules, is training, is trying to improve, and is doing the very best they can to achieve that balance that you've been discussing, Christopher.
And I'm curious with that, because I see that we don't have too much time left. I want to make sure that, as probably a final question or two, I'm sure bubbles up, that we think about on this discussion. I know we've talked about it as almost a path forward, but coming back to these ideas of dialogue and communication, respect, and community involvement, what strikes both of you as some of the most important takeaways when we think about how folks who are in the prosecutorial space can work with communities, and what that path forward may look like, ensuring that there are ways in which those dialogues can continue and people can be involved in the work that is currently happening?
Well, I'll go ahead and address it. You have to look at it this way, and this, it's a question of mindset. I mean, it's a pretty loaded question what you've asked, and I'm trying to figure out how best to explain it. But you have to go into it with the mindset that nobody in a particular community was born already distrusting the police, hating the police, and wanting to fight with the police. And hopefully no police officer ever went to the police academy and said, I can't wait to get my badge. That way I can go ahead and trample on people's rights, and I could, do bad things in a given community. But some of those views are a reflection of what's happened to people in the past. And part of the exercise is acknowledging what happened to people in the past, certainly not minimizing it. And this goes equally for whether it's the community member or the police officer, because many of them in the past have had bad experiences dealing with different people in different communities, and saying, not everybody's like that. And you have to move forward and not keep your eye consistently on the rearview mirror. Because if you keep your eye on the rearview mirror, you're going to crash your car. You need to look forward, and you need to see what's coming ahead. And that's difficult sometimes, because you don't know the baggage that your police officers or agents are bringing. You don't necessarily know the baggage that your community members are bringing, but you have to get them to a place where they're working collaboratively in spite of that baggage. And that's hard. That's not easy. That's hard.
I think it's also seeing the best in everyone, treating everyone like a person, and approaching every new relationship with, we should be friends. We should collaborate. We should be able to work together. And starting out with that kind of, positive view, rather than the worst, like what's going to happen here, or what's this going to be like. It's starting out with and that's very difficult to do. It's very hard to give someone the benefit of a doubt. I spent many years in Cleveland, and Tony doesn't know this, he doesn't experience it, but in Cleveland in January, it is cold, and the wind comes off the lake, and it blows. And I was waiting at the bus stop downtown, in my skirt, my high heels, I have my bag, it was cold, and the bus was right there, but it was the first bus stop. And the bus usually would pull up and let us sit on the bus to keep us warm, but today the driver didn't. And I was thinking to myself, cursing 20 ways till Sunday in my head about why this bus driver just wouldn't pull up and let me on the bus. I mean, it's freezing. But I said to myself, you know what? I don't know what's happening. Maybe she's having a bad day. I'm just going to smile when I get on the bus and say, hi, how are you? And I had to swallow hard, bite my tongue, and that's exactly what I did. And I noticed there was someone else on the bus with her. And I'm the last bus stop. And so the person got off one stop before, and the driver said, I want to thank you so much for being so nice and understanding. That was my supervisor. We were being audited, and we get in trouble if we let people on the bus early. And I knew it was cold, and I knew you were suffering, and I'm really sorry I felt so bad. And that stuck with me, because I had a choice of how to handle that situation. And I got lucky that day and handled it well, but it stayed with me, because I think as we approach every situation, think about that bus example and wonder, we don't know what someone else has been through or what they're going through, but let's assume the best. Let's assume they want to let us on the bus, and let's find a way to meet them halfway, 3/4 of the way, or as far as we have to go, because if the shoe was on the other foot, that's how we'd want to be treated too. And so I think that's the approach I take to community outreach, and one that I try to live in my life. And hopefully, at least up in Northern District of New York, that'll start to make some, we can help make some good progress and start to, make some good progress.
It also helps when you have a bubbly personality like you, Tony. I'm not so sure that would have flied with me.
Well, and yes, and you're right, U.S. Attorney Bacon, it's cold up in Albany, as we both know, and U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, if it ever snows, that's a whole different problem where you're based right now. So,
oh yeah,
yeah, right. Yeah,
Christopher, who complains when it's 60?
Yeah, I can. I can imagine.
We got to close the schools. We got to close the schools.
No school. That's right. No school. No school. I see something that just popped up, and it's hopefully an easy question. I'm curious, because we kind of hit on this a little bit. When it comes to social media and thinking about the privacy interests that people have with social media. I think this is a misconception that frequently, at least I remember, as frequently somebody who was constantly using social media. Let me ask the question this way, but certainly feel free to reframe and answer or comment however you wish. Why do we think everybody has this incredible belief that social media isn't public? Because I'm shocked about the ways in which social media really is available as a tool where people will make it very easy publicly to see what they're doing. And from a law enforcement perspective, you often don't even need to use any of the tools that are available under the Constitution or statute or regulation, because I can remember investigations myself where I just had people Googling, printing out pieces of paper that had the images right there, and that's all you needed. And so I'm just curious to know both of your thoughts on how social media has had an impact on kind of everything that we've just talked about.
Christopher, why are you making our job harder telling people about that? Really,
the cat's
man?
out of the bag. The cat's out of the bag.
I don't understand why people post something for the world to see and think it's private. It is not private. It never was private. You never intended it to be private. And if you want to go ahead and post a picture of you and your friends who are convicted felons with a couple of AK-47s and wads of cash and a kilo of Coke, I'm going to go ahead and use it against you. It's simple as that.
In some ways, it really is as simple as that, isn't it?
Oh, it really is. I'm not going to complicate it anymore. I'm going to print it and I'm going to go into court and you're going to jail. It's simple as that.
It's incredible to see how social media has had that impact and has had that shift. U.S. Attorney Bacon, I'm sure you feel the same way when it comes to some of both the elder law work that you've done and other places, because it's shocking what people think is protected that is not. It's public.
It really is, and how you can get leads on cases from it too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that people post things and you can hear and see what's happening. And, you know, we often, it's not uncommon to find leads for cases on social media just from that.
But the flip side of that is, just like I'll have the conversation with the defendant after I convict him, explaining to him that social media is not private, I sometimes have similar conversations with the police officer that says, dude, you're going to take the stand and testify, and you're going to need to explain this stuff that you posted on your Facebook or your Instagram, or, or frankly, you know what, you can't explain it, so I'm not calling you as a witness. Mm-hmm. So it works, equally with everyone.
Mm-hmm.
That's very true. It's one of the reasons why until this particular job, I never had any of those things, because you're absolutely right. You're exactly right, because it is a two-edged sword. And with the very little bit of time remaining, because I want to make sure to allow both of you to say something as we close, I do see one more question, unless anything else pops in, about the exceptions to search warrant requirements. And I think this is actually very interesting, because there's so much that comes from the Constitution, the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments, and the Fourth particularly here. There's so much that comes from statute, and there's so much that comes from policy. But I can even think of instances where I remember doing motions hearings on the Fourth Amendment when it came to exceptions to the requirements for getting a search warrant, because they do exist, and they, in many cases, exist for very good reasons. Because you can have, and certainly feel free to comment further, but things like exigent circumstances where you had a chance. This is really the one chance that you have to in hot pursuit follow somebody that may have committed some sort of offense, and or plain view doctrine, which these are all the fun legal things that we think about, right? When you could just sort of see things that you didn't expect you would see, but definitely exist. What do you think about this balance between the absolute importance of a search warrant and a sworn search warrant that says what you're looking for, and how that protects civil liberties, versus, for example, exceptions that may exist? And frequently I see somebody mentioned like cars, and I think U.S. Attorney Gonzalez, I'm sure that's come up previously, because cars are a great example of where sometimes the Fourth Amendment can be a little bit tricky.
Sure. And again, you're back to that same balance of protecting the public versus, protecting constitutional rights and protecting other rights. And there's a myriad of exceptions. If, for example, you invite the police into your house because you want a police report for your insurance because somebody stole your iPhone, and when they walk in, they see in the corner of your house a imprinting machine and credit card numbers, and you're falsifying identifications. Well, are the police supposed to turn a blind eye to that? No, absolutely not. They're supposed to go ahead and act on it, or they see drugs, or they see some type of contraband, or something like that. What are they supposed to do? Walk out and pretend it never happened and then try to go get a warrant while you're destroying that evidence? No, we're back to that balance between, protecting people, and are the police in a place that they're allowed to be, or is there, as you said, a set of exigent circumstances? I walked by the house, I heard the woman screaming, yelling, "Don't shoot me, don't shoot me, don't shoot me." What are you going to do? Wait until the shot is fired so you can put that on the affidavit and then have probable cause to go to the judge and now you're looking for a dead body instead of a live body? Again, you're back to that balance.
And I'll mention U.S. Attorney Gonzalez. I actually had that case when I was a state prosecutor. And that's actually one of the Fourth Amendment arguments that I've made in court, was exactly what you just said. It was somebody walking past the house and somebody screaming and all of those things, and arguing that Fourth Amendment balance and what happened in that incredible fact pattern or circumstances. And it's part of what comes with the territory and the job. But because we only have a few minutes left, I want to give both of you a chance to kind of have a closing statement when it comes to, you both sit in so many ways at the pinnacle of justice, at the pinnacle of ensuring that these rights and responsibilities are protected, but yet communities are protected too, and that we do everything, and you do everything that's in your power to protect life and liberty and property when it comes to the jurisdictions. And I know both of you have learned so many things over the years on what that's like, from individual examples and just experiences that are very unique. And so I'm just curious to know what your closing thoughts might be for our audience here tonight, because I know there's no question in my mind, they've really enjoyed having a chance to hear the expertise that both of you, the decades that both of you bring to incredibly important positions in our society.
Tony, you want to go first, or you want me to go first?
I will, and I'll give you the last word. I have behind me the Lady Liberty, and I don't know if you can tell in the video, but she's blind, and she's holding the scales of justice. And I have her here in my conference room because it's an important reminder to me, and I wish everyone had these in their homes and in their offices to think about, that first of all, the balance is always changing. It's not, the scales of justice aren't perfect. And that we have to understand that they're going to tilt a little bit, and that's okay. What we can't have is this. We can't have extremes, but we have to understand that, as we have issues like 9/11, or when we have 12-year-olds getting shot in their own home, or other types of circumstances that might require a little more on one end. And when we don't have those, and it might require a little less on one end, right? But I think, so that's one important part of her. But the second part is that she's blind. And that means that as we're making decisions, as we're making judgments, not just about a case, but about people, just people we're interacting with, let's not think of them in terms of, anything other than who they are, right? Don't see me as a female law enforcement officer. See me as part of the community trying to make a difference, right? Let's all try to take down some of those boxes we put people in, and just treat every situation, every single unique situation, as it's the first one, and come to it without any expectation, because that's what Lady Liberty wants us to do. That's really the command, is to treat everybody with a blank slate and to treat everybody the same. And so I think if we can start that, or keep that in mind as we all dialogue going forward, then together as a community and as a group, we'll be able to find, for right now and in our time, where should the balance be? And it'll be something we'll all be really comfortable with, we'll be excited about, we'll get behind, and then we can move forward. And the community will be safer, it'll be better, and it will be stronger.
I look at it this way. We all want the same thing, which is a safe place to live, a safe place to raise our kids, a safe place to live our lives. The community wants that. The citizens that live in the community want it. The law enforcement officers that work in that community want it. Everybody wants it. And you can make it as micro as in a given block or as macro as the world and our country as citizens of the world want that for everyone else. So then the question becomes, well, how do we achieve that? And, and it's funny because I've never spoken to Tony about this, but anybody who comes into my office with any question knows what are the two questions I'm going to ask them. Can we legally do it? And if the answer is yes, should we do it? Which is exactly what you said earlier today, Tony, because that's really the guiding principle. It's number one, can we do it? And if we can't do it, we're not going to do it. Okay, because we're not going to go ahead and violate the law to try to achieve something. And then even if we can do it, should we do it? Are we going to be proud of ourselves when the newspaper reports that the next morning? How's my mom going to feel when her friends ask her about what her son did that they read in the newspaper? With those guiding principles, you try to do the job to the best of your abilities. And, sometimes people clash, but they clash when they're all trying to achieve the same thing.
And I will just echo exactly what you just said, because whenever I'm thinking back, whenever I had to make a decision, the very next thing I had to do was write up a press release and make sure I was approving it. So because optics help actually in many ways think of what we should do? Is this serving the interests of the community and the position? And so, with that, I'm coming in with just 1 minute left. I want to hand it back over to Emily and Roy. But before I do so, U.S. Attorney Gonzalez and U.S. Attorney Bacon, it has been an honor and a privilege to have people with quite literally so many decades of experience at the very top of their game, who are day in and day out on the front lines of quite literally keeping our country safe. And so I just want to say thank you to both of you for joining us this evening. And I look forward to having additional opportunities to continue conversations.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been such a fun conversation, and it's similar to the conversation we had last week. It's an interesting kind of peek behind the curtain for those of us who have not had professional colleagues or friends that work in law enforcement. So really, really useful. So thank you so much for your time this evening. And for everybody else, please join us again next week. We are going to dig next week into a lot of First Amendment free speech issues. So bring your questions with regards to free speech, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you then.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks, Christopher, Tony, and Tony.
Thank you.